So good morning to everybody here on the East Coast in the United States, and good evening to our colleagues in Mongolia and Asia broadly. I'm Scott Mastick, Vice President for Programs at the International Republican Institute. More than 30 years after its transition away from communism, Mongolia's democracy is being tested in new ways as events surrounding the recent June 9 presidential election vividly highlight the challenges Mongolia faces. The April 2021 Constitutional Court's decision declaring President Batulga ineligible to run for a second term per change constitutional amendments was highly controversial and contributed to polarizing rhetoric and political fracturing between party leaders throughout the campaign period. ODIHR's election observation findings characterized the election as transparent and having complied with international standards. However, it noted there was limited independent information on candidates in the media, public debate, or platform analysis for citizens. It also critiqued lack of women's participation in campaigns, suggesting messages appealing to women were virtually absent from candidate platforms. These and other factors may have contributed to low voter participation in the election. Turnout was 59.4% of the eligible population, regrettably the lowest turnout for a presidential election in the country's democratic history. Despite this, Mongolia's commitment to open elections and preservation of democratic institutions remains noteworthy. It shows resilience to regional pressures, and let's not forget, Mongolia remains a democracy surrounded by authoritarian states. The Mongolian people also still overwhelmingly support democracy as the best option for their country. There's plenty of data out there that shows this. And so we should at once be interested and concerned, perhaps, but also not lose sight of the considerable democratic progress Mongolia has made over the years. Today, we will hear from IRI-Mongolia Director Craig Castagna and Asia Foundation Country Representative Mark Koenig, both of whom were present in Ulaanbaatar throughout the campaign period and the election, thanks to a USAID CEPS program being implemented by our respective organizations. Craig and Mark, who worked on a variety of activities around the elections, will share insights and analysis on the June 9th election with an eye toward what comes next. So Mongolia has and remains to be a strategic partner, critically strategic partner for the United States in this part of the world. We look forward to hearing from each of them today. We have about 30 minutes to hear from Craig and Mark. And after that, we're going to go to questions that will be moderated by Rhonda Mays, our Asian Pacific Region Deputy Director. So without further delay, I will turn the floor over to you, Craig, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Rhonda, and thank you, everyone, for joining. Mark and I are happy to share some of our analysis and insights from the recent election that took place here. And I'm going to, like Scott said, I'm going to provide a couple of brief remarks giving an overview of what just took place, and then Mark will tag on to that and add in some further analysis. So basically, as Scott had mentioned in his opening, Mongolia recently held its presidential election on June 9th. And this was the 8th presidential election since the country had its first presidential election back in 1993. And I would say that you could describe this election as pretty low-key, almost a quiet campaign. And it seemed to have just came and went quite quickly. After a brief 15-day campaign period, and in the middle of a spike in COVID cases, Mongolians overwhelmingly elected the former prime minister and the now former Mongolian People Party chair, Hudalsuk. And this was a historic landslide where he garnered 70% of the vote. That was the most that any presidential candidate had ever garnered in an election. And so Hudalsuk's victory, it follows major MPP victories recently. In the June 2020 parliamentary election, the MPP maintained their supermajority in the state Great Hall. And in October 2020, in the local elections, they won most of the IMAGs and they maintained control over the UB City Council. So at this point, the MPP now controls the presidency, the cabinet, and they hold and still hold a supermajority in parliament. And so in vast contrast to that, to the MPP, we have an opposition party, a major opposition party, the Democratic Party, which is really divided at the moment. They had a historically poor showing in this recent presidential election. Their candidate got only 6% of the vote. And at this point, there are effectively two DPs. There's not really one Democratic Party. You have two Democratic parties, and there's lots of legal and political limbo that the two factions are going over. Many of this is being litigated in the courts, and it's been litigated in the courts for many months now, trying to answer the question of who is the legitimate chair, who is the legitimate DP. And so as a result, DP's highest profile candidate, Batoga, the former president, as Scott had mentioned, he was ineligible to run after the Constitutional Court ruled back in April that incumbents were not eligible to run and past presidents would be barred from running again. So essentially, this only exacerbated the party rift, and the candidate from the DP ended up being S. Irton, who essentially struggled with messaging and struggled to really unify the party behind him throughout the very short campaign. So at the end of this, whereas Hudelsuk was overwhelmingly elected in a landslide, the DP candidate really struggled to get any traction at all and resulted in this historically poor showing. And in the end, he got just over 70,000 votes, which was slightly more than the actual empty ballots that people submitted as a protest vote, right? They called them the white ballots. There was also the third party candidate from the Zuhun electorate led by the National Labor Party, and their candidate was D. Enkbot. He received 20% of the votes cast. This was a strong showing for a political party that holds just one seat in the current parliament. And it's important to remember that only political parties with candidates in the state Great Hall with at least one seat were able to run in this election. So that led to an MPP candidate, a DP candidate, and the Zuhun electorate candidate. In the end, the MPRP, the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, did not run a candidate. This is Enkbayar's party, the former president, former prime minister, and they endorsed the MPP candidate, and they officially merged back with the MPP. So as a result, we had an election that was really uncompetitive in terms of the actual campaign period and the results. A couple of notable qualities about the election. Scott mentioned this earlier, but this was the lowest turnout in a presidential election, 59%. And this was due largely to multiple variables, one being COVID-19. Cases had been surging for several weeks up until the election and even into the election, where we were seeing over 2,000 cases a day. And this is something that Mongolia is still going through. And this likely contributed to a very low turnout, and people ended up staying at home. Another thing that probably contributed to the low turnout was the fact that the major opposition party was very unenthusiastic about its candidate, right? 6% showing, it didn't go very well. There was a split between the party. Most likely a lot of people from the DP stayed home and really didn't participate in the election in the end. And I mentioned earlier, but there was just a very short campaign period. So this was only a 15-day campaign period. There ended up being no debate. There was supposed to be a debate, but there was no debate in the end. And there were not many rallies or really media coverage of the campaign just because it was so short. So yes, there were rallies, and some of them were quite controversial because videos went viral of people crowding and gathering around candidates. But in the end, I would say, compared to other campaigns that I've observed in the past, this was very low key, very quiet, not many rallies. And I would say there was a sort of inevitability to a degree about this election. Hudelsuk was always the front runner. And even though the campaign was very short and he won by historic margins, and he took every IMAG, he took every district in UB. And if you take a look at the election map, the entire map is red because he won every single constituency. And just to give you an idea of this win, even in places like IRI-Mag, where I served as a Peace Corps volunteer many years ago, which is traditionally a DP stronghold, and it has 2 members of parliament from DP. He won by an overwhelming majority, even in places like IRI-Mag. And Scott also mentioned this, but despite these challenges, it's important to note that international observers and domestic observers both reported that polling was well organized and administered efficiently and transparency. And in the end, sometimes there are claims of rigged results in Mongolian elections. That did not happen this time. And again, obviously, that with a landslide victory, there were no claims of a rigged election. So at this point, Khurelsukh is the first president to be elected to a single 6-year term. And this follows constitutional amendments in 2019 that eliminated 4-year terms and 2 4-year terms. And so the 2019 amendments reduced the powers of the president in favor of the prime minister, and it gave the prime minister more power, diluted some of the president's influence over judicial appointments and the power to shape the cabinet. And so, but at this point, with this new 6-year president and these new powers and the supermajority in MPP, it's still too early to see what kind of president Khurelsukh is going to be, right? Is he going to end up expanding the powers of the presidency, or is he going to really keep it in line with what the constitutional amendments had intended to do, which was to actually weaken the president in favor of the prime minister, the cabinet, and even the parliament? At the end of this, I would say, obviously it was a free and fair election, but there were definitely gaps, and it was not without controversy. So one of the big things that was noted from both the domestic observation and from the OSCE's international observation was just the overall lack of analytical reporting, very little discussion, substantive and objective discussions on the candidates' electoral platforms. And again, the short campaign didn't really help with that, but this was something that was definitely lacking, was media coverage, objective media reporting. There was also an appeal to the General Election Commission regarding the candidate selection process. And this is when I mentioned earlier, there are effectively two Democratic parties. They both ended up nominating candidates. From one faction, you had Yurtin, who ended up becoming the nominee. And from the other faction, you had Altenhoyek, former prime minister, current member of parliament. And he did appeal to the Court of Appeals when his candidacy was not accepted from the GEC. But the court rejected these complaints and nothing ever came of it. We mentioned earlier, but the Constitutional Court barred incumbent President Batoga from being able to run. And right after that, this was right before the election, but the president then issued a decree to dissolve the Mongolian People's Party, to dissolve an entire political party. And that ended up not going anywhere. The Supreme Court, this was a decree that was submitted to the Supreme Court. It was not accepted. But right after that, the State Great Horo quickly approved the Constitutional Court ruling, and they ended up amending the law on presidential elections, which had been passed in December, and they took out the word re-election. So at the end, the State Great Horo, which is not supposed to amend election laws in an election year, they ended up doing it after the Constitutional Court came down with that ruling in April. So at this point, just to take a step back, the MPP obviously is quite consolidated. The DP is quite divided. The Hoon coalition, it has 1 seat in parliament, and so has very limited powers, obviously, versus, say, the MPP that has 62 seats in parliament. The MPP now has a supermajority in parliament. They have the president. They have the cabinet also. And so, in a way, Mongolia should be given credit for successfully organizing now 3 elections during this pandemic, right? Last June, last October, and now this presidential election. But obviously more needs to be done, and measures to boost transparency, promote inclusivity in politics, especially at the leadership levels where women and youth remain underrepresented and underengaged. This will be really important work to continue to do. And also in this new era of MPP dominance, efforts to stimulate policy debate, discourse, support for civil society to ensure that political pluralism is supported, and especially youth remain engaged in politics and governance, because Mongolia, as you know, is a very young country demographically. And so just as a final plug before handing it off to my colleague from Asia Foundation, Mark, IRI and TAF are in partnership right now with our USAID funded program, strengthening women and youth engagement in the electoral and political processes in Mongolia. The program is called the SWEEPM program. And we're working together on a lot of these issues, supporting the media, supporting civil society, supporting voter education. And a lot of our work had focused on the pre-election environment, before the parliamentary elections, around the local elections, and now obviously with the presidential elections. And we'll continue to work together under the SWEEPM program now in our post-election period. And there's plenty of work to be done, and I'm happy to take it. And I'll hand it over to Mark.
Thanks, Craig, and a really great overview. So rather than repeating too much, I'm going to try and build out a couple of the narratives that the crowd may find a bit interesting. So briefly, I'm Mark Koenig from the Asia Foundation, our country representative, and we are working with IRI on the SWEEPM, SEPS-funded SWEEPM project. And we certainly watched this election with a lot of interest. Historically, we've often talked about presidential elections in Mongolia as swinging back against the party that won the previous parliamentary elections. There's this one-year gap, and traditionally we've seen a swing towards the party who had the worst performance in the parliamentary elections. So we've interpreted this historically as Mongolian voters seeing desirability and checks and balances and wanting some balance in government. But we're also seeing evidence this time around that makes us think that candidates really matter in Mongolia, especially in the presidential elections. And we should really point out that Mr. Hurlsuk, President Hurlsuk, was a very strong candidate. Sometimes it doesn't always transfer across cultures, but he has a certain charisma. He's proven to be a very clever politician at different points in his career, and he has led some sort of effort at a refreshing of the MPP party that has proven to be quite effective. They have introduced a lot of younger, more technocratic faces over the last year, starting with the Prime Minister himself and a range of people around them. They were the only party that had a really concerted effort to create a youth platform in their party platform. And they had a social media game to go along with their traditionally strong get out the vote ground game in the IMAGs that shows quite a lot of evolution. Now, one of the concerns is that evolution is coming from such a position of strength that they have a lot more resources, a lot more space to build out the party, to bring in new faces, and that it really creates a situation where the MPP is lapping the field a bit. And that is at the same time coupled with the historic weakness of the Democratic Party. And the DP has always been known for being somewhat fractured, this interesting alliance of forces that has broken apart and been put back together at different times. But at no point has that fracture been as contentious and as reliant on the court system to help resolve its own internal negotiations. And in some ways, the DP over the last 6 months kind of lost control of the power to even resolve the internal dispute themselves. And that raises a lot of questions about the role that the courts and bodies like the General Election Commission played in resolving, or in the end not resolving, these internal party disputes. There, of course, was speculation about some sort of interference. It's very hard to say what did and didn't happen, because a lot of the legal decisions that were made along the way were fairly obscure administrative decisions about party seals and rules that even among legal experts are really challenging to work out what the appropriate decision may have been. And I think the Constitutional Court decision on President Batoga, I think what made it controversial is not the legal analysis itself, but the fact that when the constitutional amendments were made, there was some sort of understanding there had been kind of like a handshake deal, a verbal understanding that President Batoga would be allowed to run again. But it wasn't something that was codified in any legal way. And so there was always this opening for a court case to be brought to challenge the idea that he could be a candidate. So it's a really messy, muddled story that involves both these really incredible fractures in the Democratic Party and historic strength of the MPP. And the MPP, to its credit, has done quite a lot to modernize itself. And again, to repeat myself, the social media strategy and activity of the MPP this time was something that we hadn't seen from them in the past. I think specifically on the performance of Mr. Inkpat and the Labour Party, what we're seeing also is perhaps the limits of this very short campaign period for these smaller parties to break through. Mr. Inkpat was a strong candidate, and he had, again, quite a savvy social media strategy and a very positive message that was trying to appeal to urban, younger voters. And a 20% performance in some ways would be quite good for a candidate that didn't have much name recognition outside of UB going into this election period. But in a 2-week election campaign period, it's very hard to build up that name in a way that you'd need to reach out to a wider group of voters. And the fact that he did test positive for COVID-19 in the last days of the campaign, and that led to the cancellation of the one TV debate that was going to be a chance for him to show himself to many of the Mongolians who were not familiar with him, was potentially a unfortunate turn of events that lost him a last chance to make up a bit more ground. So it really was a election where everything fell into place for the MPP and President Horulsuk. It also should be noted that the negotiation to merge with the MPRP was, again, a very politically savvy decision. It really took out the right flank for Mr. Horulsuk, where he took care of the more nationalist traditional voters who often support the MPRP, and could focus some of the campaigning away towards some of this middle ground, some of the urban voters and other pieces. So again, another show of great strength, and the MPP, being so dominant, had a lot to offer the MPRP in a negotiation to merge the parties back together. And we'll see over the next few months what they offered and whether they come through on the deals that were made, whether it involves the parliamentary by-elections or whether it involves cabinet positions. But they have it, by having all this power, they have the ability to bring in more actors into the fold of the MPP party. And I think we come out of this with an MPP that's so big that in many ways it's the most diverse it's been in terms of representing different opinions, different types of individuals, different actors, that will create an interesting dynamic going into this period of governing now. For the next 3 years until the next parliamentary elections, the MPP has a clear opportunity to put its policy vision into practice if they can be united and actually get some of the technical work done. But because the party has grown so broad, it'll be quite interesting to see how all those pieces fit together. And I think there are real different ideas about what to do on even things like foreign direct investment. You have quite a pro-FDI prime minister, and you have a president now who ran on a platform that involved a lot of not outright, but a lot of insinuations of kind of resource nationalism. His party tagline was, Mongolia's wealth for Mongolians, more or less. And so you have some interesting dynamics at play there. There are, of course, going to be concerns that having so much power accumulated in one party does raise questions about how they will choose to wield that power. And I think the checks and balances that the presidency put into place were fairly limited from over the last few years, were fairly limited from a legal standpoint. I mean, the president would often veto things, but the parliament could overrule that veto. But there was a certain symbolic check and balance. And also you had the president sitting on the National Security Council, which will now be united as well. So I think there are concerns that there is a situation where power could be abused or overstepped, but it's not necessarily a non-democratic outcome. I think the strongest candidate won and the strongest party won. And as Craig was saying, there's been disappointment, there's been frustration for many of those in the opposition camps, but there hasn't been the anger or the accusations that you heard maybe after the parliamentary election. And the reason, I think, in part was that at the parliamentary election, you had a party that won 45% of the vote, getting more than 80% of the seats in parliament, right? A big disconnect between the level of support and the outcome. Here you had a popular candidate from a strong party winning an overwhelming victory, and the narrative kind of matched. As Craig said, there was a certain feeling of inevitability. There was a bubble in UB, especially on social media, where the energy around candidate Inkbot felt stronger in the city, and a lot of people started to think maybe he can pull it off, maybe he can do it, because if you were an urban elite, let's say, most of your friends on Facebook were voting Inkbot, it seemed like. It just had that kind of buzz in the social media world. But I think most analysts felt that this was a fairly strong positioning for Mr. Hurlsuk, and would have been a big surprise if he hadn't won, or even if he had been pulled to runoff. I think finally, going into the outlook going forward, I think there are big questions about how politics reshapes itself to be competitive, and big questions about whether the MPP indulges a tendency that it's had to kind of kick the opposition parties when they're down, let's say. I don't want to say there's anything that's been clearly extra legal or illegal, but there have been efforts to certainly dominate the narratives in media with funding and other sources. Certainly a certain appreciation for the misery of the opposition parties and doing what they can to limit their ability to get their narrative out. But I do think we have so much unprecedented power that it's really important that the MPP sees this as a risk, this overconcentration of power, and is a responsible actor that participates in the creation of platforms for discourse and debate around policy and important questions that they're going to be answering over the coming years. Where does the third party NLP and the right person electorate go from here? They've had a tendency to basically disappear in between elections. And as Craig said, a 20% showing is something to build on, but it takes a lot of energy, a lot of fundraising, a lot of support to build on that in non-elections year. And they do have a by-election, a parliamentary by-election coming up, which will be one opportunity to try and build out their support and build out the narrative around the party as a meaningful opposition party, and potentially even the second largest opposition party they can now say after the collapse of the DP. And the DP really is going to come down to whether former President Batulga now. He was remarkably silent during the campaign period after being barred for running from re-election. He in no way came out and supported the DP candidate because his faction tried to put up a different candidate of the DP. And even when that came out, he didn't aggressively attack Mr. Hurlsuk. He didn't throw in his support behind Mr. Inkbot. He was more or less silent, and he even gave an address on the eve of the election or 2 days before the election that some interpreted as a tacit endorsement of Mr. Hurlsuk, despite being banned from running for re-election. So he clearly is thinking about his future, political or otherwise, and he remains the biggest name on the DP side. He's not a traditional DP actor, which is why the DP has been so split. He's basically an outsider who has become the face of the party in some ways. But we don't have clear indication about his political future. And he is still the second most well-known, I'd say, politician after President Hurlsuk now. And his decision will be a big part of how the DP might resolve its internal conflict, whether it splits or whether it unifies around some common platform and common candidate. So there's some really big questions, both about the way the MPP is going to govern with this consolidated power, as well as how the opposition parties are going to reassess the situation and come up with a strategy to rebuild, because they're really starting from a very low point at this point, and there's a lot to be done to restore that kind of competitiveness that any thriving democracy is going to need. So I think best to stop there, but hopefully we'll get some great questions and have a rich conversation around some of these themes that are emerging. But thank you for joining us today. I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Craig. We have about 25 minutes or so for some questions, so we can open the floor to all of you who are joining us. If you're able to use the raise hand function in Teams, I think that would be sort of easiest to moderate the conversation. And then just a quick reminder that the session is being recorded, so bear that in mind as you're asking your questions. So now the floor is open to anyone who has questions, and maybe I'll take moderator's prerogative and kick us off while everyone is sort of thinking about what they want to dig into from these great presentations. I'm curious, Craig and Mark, since our work largely focuses on engaging women and engaging young people in the political processes. How did women and young people vote in this election in relation to sort of the larger population? And is there such a thing in the country as a women's vote or a youth vote? And what bearing does that have on sort of the political situation going forward? So Craig, maybe kick it to you first and then over to Mark.
Sure, certainly. Yeah, so great question, Rhonda. Basically, yeah, in terms of voting and how the women and youth votes went, I think, well, overall, obviously, it was a historically low voter turnout, right? But if you peel it back and look at it gender-wise, women actually voted in greater numbers, right? So it's roughly equal, but women, there were more women voters. But when it came to youth, there was a much lower turnout. I think the numbers that I saw, 18 to 39-year-olds voted at 45% turnout. So most people under the age of 40, most voters did not vote. If you look at the older demographics, they are smaller in number because, again, the country is just very young. However, they voted at almost double the rate. So I think over 60 years of age, they were voting at almost at over 70%, which was double for people under 40. So I think in terms of the sort of engagement of young people, like Mark said, there was a sense of some energy behind, especially behind EncBot. And a lot of this was on social media. But at the end, voter turnout in UB was just over 50%, maybe 51%. So where most of the young people were voting, there was low turnout to begin with. And in the end, most young people decided to actually sit this one out. And again, that could be for various reasons. But I think when we look at political engagement, women obviously are very politically engaged and also probably less so represented, especially in leadership positions in political parties in higher office. And like the OSCE had mentioned, there was virtually no discussion of women's issues in any of the candidate platforms. However, women still came out and voted in pretty large numbers. In terms of the youth, it was much less so. And this is unfortunate because young people did turn out in greater numbers during the parliamentary elections in June, and we saw actually an uptick. So I think this might have been an election where young people might not have been excited about their choices. There was only three choices, obviously, and the white ballot movement also didn't gain a lot of traction like it did in the previous elections. So that's just generally how it broke down for women and youth voter engagement.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that a little bit, I think the even like the presentation of candidates is extremely masculine in Mongolia. The kind of Mr. Hurlsuk had some Putinesque pictures, shirtless and horse riding and whatnot, and it is part of the political culture, especially when you get to the president. And it's the presentation was a little bit different for Mr. Inkpat this time, and it was interesting to see they made an effort that I think is almost unprecedented, I want to say, in Mongolia to show his wife as a part of the elections package, right? And she was out there, and she's a very successful, competent individual, and she didn't speak much, I don't think, but they made an effort to present them as kind of a package, which was interesting, I think, to try and appeal maybe to younger as well as women voters. But again, I don't think we have any data that suggests that women Mongolian voters don't respond to that same imagery of leadership that is quite masculine. I think especially older and rural voters, male and female, seem to respond to these images of stereotypical strong leadership, which clearly has a gender dynamic. So I think the political culture, political messaging is still somewhat masculine. So we couldn't say that not making a concerted effort to appeal to women is not necessarily a bad election strategy, given the kind of culture and the style of leadership that is still somehow held up as an idealized in Mongolia. With the youth, I think it's fair to say that in the parliamentary elections last year, there was a lot of energy, especially around labor and the right person electorate. And I think there may have been a little bit of frustration that didn't get more traction in the parliamentary election. The energy didn't lead to the results. And that adds to this sense of inevitability during this presidential election that I think maybe stunted the growth of the Inkpat campaign a bit. That there were definitely a group of believers and people who thought he could pull it off, but I think there are a lot of others who kind of had lived through that and come out to vote for the parliamentary elections and had lost a bit of, I don't want to say faith in the system, but we're frustrated by the fact that energy hadn't translated into more parliamentary results and victories. And so I think there was a bit of frustration that is going to take some time to mend for sure. But yeah, I think we saw more efforts, however, from the candidates to specifically reach out to youth. And that goes for Mr. Hurlsuk too. He cut a bunch of videos of he used a lot of social influencers, cut some videos of, like skateboarders with Hurlsuk t-shirts on. Like they had a very clear attempt to reach out to a younger, more urban voter that I think wasn't there necessarily in the past. So I think you saw that this growth of the youth population, even if they're not voting at high rates, still they were more than half of the electorate that voted, is shaping political strategies, even without those voter numbers ticking up as high as many would have liked to see.
Great, thank you both. We can go now to the floor. Alicia Campy, it looked like you had your hand up first. Did you still have a question?
Yes, can you hear me? Thank you very much for your analysis and presentation. I actually have two related questions, and they are connected to the fact that neither of you in your presentation, with the exception of maybe one sentence, talked much about the president's and his possible change or continuation of the present foreign policy, which is his main function in the Mongolian system. So my first question is, in the campaign, do you believe there was foreign monies brought into the campaign supporting any of the candidates or not? And if yes or no, why? And at the same time in the campaign, you haven't discussed money at all, beyond saying that the MPP was well funded. So the question is where are these candidates? Where were they getting their funds from? And the second part of the question is more specifically, what do you think the new President Horulsuk's foreign policy, including foreign economic policies, will be, since some people have been concerned he may be more influenced by his two large neighbors than other candidates, but other people have rejected that analysis. Thank you.
Mark, you want me to take that?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in after you, Craig.
Perfect. So thank you, Alicia. Great questions. So a couple of things. First, in terms of the campaign finance, right? There's actually not a lot that we know yet, because essentially what happens is, and this was mentioned in the OSCE report, the campaign filings are submitted, but they're later audited and they're looked at, and I don't think they're really released or publicized until about a month or two after the election. So we haven't really seen the official campaign spending. You know, that being said, if you look at it unofficially, right, like as Mark had mentioned, clearly the MPP had some deep pockets and resources, because there were really major stars and singers and dancers and musicians who were actively, I don't want to say actively stumping, but they were making videos for the president, and they were very active on social media. So just to give you an example, one of the biggest social influencers here, his name is Bator Angoch. He just won the Dancing with the Stars here in Mongolia, so he's really just a very well-known social influencer. He was actively campaigning for President Horulsuk. There's another hip-hop group called Vanderbu, who are kind of the biggest artists in Mongolia right now, again, actively campaigning for Horulsuk. And there was a lot of chatter online basically saying, obviously, these social influencers are not working for free, and these musicians are not campaigning for free. It costs money. And so I think we haven't really seen the official campaign filings yet, but there is a sense that clearly one party had the influencers behind it. Whether or not that money came from abroad or how it did, again, I mean, unless Mark could add on to that, I just don't know how we would know that, right? I think one of the things that even the OSCE had dinged this election on was the fact that campaign finance regulations are very weak and there's virtually no enforcement, right? So you self-report your spending, and then they look at those numbers, but these numbers are not, first of all, they're not really investigated or looked at to see if they match. So for instance, the National Auditing Agency, which looks at the campaign finance reports later, they don't do any work in the field to verify, are these accurate filings, right? So I think we just don't know. Again, unless Mark could add on to that. And then to your second question of just what will the foreign policy be? Again, I think similar, it sounds like a cop-out, but similar to the campaign finance question, I think we don't know yet also. If you look at how they campaigned, all three candidates campaigned on supporting the third neighbor policy, right? So maintaining cordial relations with Russia and China, and also diversifying engagement with other third neighbors like the US and South Korea and Japan and other developing democracies. And so even Horulsuk did actively campaign on supporting at least the continuation of the third neighbor policy. But that being said, right, you know, is there a preference for Russia or for China? Again, I think that's really hard to tell. But I think that even though one of the few powers that the president has is actually foreign policy, right? That's one of the main things, commander in chief and foreign policy. But Hurlsuk has not really come down hard on one side or another, saying this is what my foreign policy is going to be. I think what we heard a lot of was more focus on domestic policy, some resource nationalism, right, in terms of the campaign. And so what does that mean for OT and other investments? That's another question, an open question. But I think in terms of the foreign policy, at least for now, it doesn't seem like it will really depart much from Batoga, his predecessor, in terms of continuing the third neighbor policy and being okay and comfortable with Russia. And also the MPP, the Hurlsuk's party, has close ties to the CCP, right? They have MOUs, they have bilateral agreements. This is something that's out in the open, it's not secretive. And so I think at the end of the day, we will see a continuation of keep good relations with the two close neighbors. Where possible, let's try to open up and further diversify relations.
Yeah, I largely concur that Mr. Hurlsuk hasn't shown a strong preference one way or the other with the two larger neighbors. I would say he hasn't been as aggressive in courting strong relationships with some of the third neighbors. He's formally in favor of it, but in his political career, he has been much more domestic focused. With President Batoga, of course, we got to kind of see it in action, whereas his close relationships with Russia were kind of well documented early on. But as time went on, he proved to be really active in pursuing the third neighbor policy and even building stronger ties with China than maybe had been initially anticipated at this outset of his presidency, because he had been quite aggressively anti-Chinese in his rhetoric during the campaign period. This time, we didn't see as much of a narrative around foreign policy preferences. The negativity around China was less. 4 years ago, there was a very strong anti-Chinese sentiment in the election tone. Even got personal, like accusing someone of having Chinese lineage was an insult that was used and insinuated at that election. And we have less clear evidence that there were, actually we heard more about external influence through social media and other means in the elections 4 years ago. It doesn't mean that it wasn't happening. It may be just too fresh to see, but I haven't heard or seen as much this time. And it was a fairly muted campaign. Last time got very negative, very aggressive, very loud, let's say. And so I think it was a different tone. And I think the inevitability or the feeling that this was likely to break one way probably toned down the amount of effort that any external actor may have put into influencing it one way or the other. I think in terms of financing, there is certainly a lot that we don't know. But I don't know that a candidate would need to take the risk of foreign funding for the elections, given the dominant position of the MPP. There's more than enough money off the books that can be garnered through domestic business interests and others. I think the trend we see of these elections are becoming more and more expensive. And I think it's fairly likely we'll see that this is the most expensive election that we've had. And that's the trend that we've seen over the last few elections. But as Craig says, the transparency is really lacking and it's very hard to track. And we know from a lot of elections that cash transactions and transactions off the books are fairly commonplace in Mongolian elections and make it very difficult to say. I do think foreign policy is going to be again made quite interesting going forward, because the MPP is not unified in its preferences. There are definitely members with very close ties to China, definitely members with very strong historic ties to Russia, and you also have quite a strong contingent who has strong relationships with Australia through study and scholarships, with the United States as well. with Japan. It's actually the MPP itself is spread out in terms of its effort. And so I do think they are trying to balance and play third neighbor. But it does become harder and harder given the economic reliance on China, which is really incredibly overwhelming. And Mr. Hurlsuk has supported domestic projects, infrastructure projects that would make export to China more easy and faster, especially on the resource side. So it is a bit hard to say, and I do think they are going to actively balance, but I do think it is worth noting that the Chinese economic dominance doesn't show any signs of waning, and it does put Mr. Hurlsuk and others in a pretty difficult position at times.
Thank you. We'll turn now to Jay.
Yeah, thank you guys for the talk. And I had two questions. So first one is MPP going to change the rules of the game, which is the election system right before the parliamentary or presidential election for the last few elections. And since like Mongolians are already get used to it and then think it's okay, it happens. And what do you think about that? Like, you know, why MPP keeps changing, and how do we like correct, how do we see it not happening, I guess, as a young Mongolian. Second one is more into, as you said, like Mr. Ex-President Batoglu stayed silent during the election, and then also his PR guy is the brother of the current prime minister. So there's a definitely strong and close ties between the current president, prime minister, and who is also the newly elected party leader, and the ex-president. And how do you see it going forward? Yeah, that's two questions.
Should I go first this time, Craig? This is for.
Sure, go for it.
Sure. So in order, yeah, absolutely. If you look at the parliamentary elections, especially, almost every election, the system is changed within a year of the election period. And it hasn't only been the MPP. Remember, the DP did it the election before. They just were probably less effective because in some ways they changed the system in a way that led to less good results. But yes, I think this is one of the fundamental flaws of parliamentary elections in Mongolia, just because the electoral strategies aren't maturing. The voters don't really have a sense of the strategy of how to vote and how their vote's going to count. And people just don't really understand how the votes led to the results that they do. And so it's a major problem for democracy and trust in the system. And how does it change? I mean, at the end of the day, it has to be a political cultural shift. There's not going to be another constitutional amendment. Technically, the constitutional changes banned it from happening within a certain time period of the election, so it should happen further out. That doesn't mean it won't happen. And it has to be essentially a part of the maturation of the political culture. There has to be some agreement. We need to pick a system and stick to it and hold each other to that. And whether or not the Mongolian political parties are ready to have that kind of agreement is unclear. And the system they used last year, which is kind of a mixed system with block voting, seems to be the system that returns the results with the biggest variation between the number of votes and the number of seats in parliament consistently. There have been a few elections they've used that system, and each time has led to overwhelming majorities. And so I think some real conversation about the system has to be had. TAF and IRI have recently been funding some really good conversation and research about historical elections performance of different system. And I think we're going to be talking about it in our programs and with our partners, academic, political leaders and party leaders, to start thinking about this earlier and hopefully have a conversation about locking in a system ahead of time and agreeing to it and hopefully not changing it. But ultimately, it's a political culture issue. There's not a legal constraint that's going to stop it right now. And the supermajority in the MPP in Parliament will make it very hard. And I don't think the public, as you say, maybe have gotten used to it to some extent. It's in the news, people note it, but it's almost expected. And so it doesn't lead to outpouring of anger or anything like that, just because everybody's done it on all sides and it's become a part of the practice. So I agree, it's a major issue. I don't think there's an easy fix. Absolutely agree that the relationship between former President Batoga and the MPP is complicated, and individuals within the MPP. Mr. Hurlsuk and Mr. Batoga have worked together on certain things in the past. They have had, seems like, open lines of communication, and they have some similarities in terms of leadership style and approach. I think that silence is quite telling, that they have in some sense more in common than Mr. Batoga had with some of those on the other wing of his own party. What exactly is going to happen? I really think it has to do with how Mr. Batoga sees his relationship with the DP, whether that's a vehicle that interests him any further. And if he goes into trying to really build the DP into a party around him and his group, then it will necessarily require him to play a more vocal oppositional role. If he wants to be elected to Parliament, maybe try and be an independent and caucus with the MPP at times and break. I mean, there's a lot of options to him. He remains very popular, but I don't have any indications yet of which path he's going. I think he's been fairly quiet about trying to work out his future. But it would be quite a powerful, in terms of populist alliance, if he did in some ways choose to be an active politician that sometimes caucused with Mr. Hurlsuk and the MPP and Mr. Oyun-Erdene, Prime Minister Oyun-Erdene as well. So it is an interesting relationship, but it seemed to fall out leading up to the elections because he was banned from running. But then that silence says that maybe it didn't fall out as much as took a pause, and now it's being rebuilt. Craig, I don't know if you have anything else to add, but that's pretty fresh.
Yeah, just to add to the second question, because Mark pretty much covered the first one on changing the election laws ahead of time. Yeah, I think in terms of Batoga, it's important to keep in mind that, the latest MEC poll that came out actually tagged him as the most popular politician in the country. He even beat out Hurlsuk. And so Hurlsuk and Batoga are clearly the two most popular politicians in the country. And Batoga can go in different directions, right? Because he does have popular appeal. But whether or not he's going to actually rejoin with the DP is in question. Right now, the Ministry of Justice has drafted a draft law on the president. And according to media reports that we've read, there's a possibility that it could restrict presidents or former presidents from rejoining political parties for up to 5 years after they're no longer president, and from running for office, engaging in political activity, in consulting for foreign invested companies. There's a whole host of restrictions. Will that apply to Batoga? It's actually not really clear. We've heard that since it was not passed while he was in office, it does not apply to him. So maybe he runs in the by-election. Maybe he runs for parliament. Perhaps he does that with the Democratic Party. But again, this is sort of unclear at this point in terms of what he's going to do. But clearly, for years, it seems that Batoga, then President Batoga, and Prime Minister Hurlsuk have been working together on many different issues. And it was really not until January that it seemed that they kind of had a break. And that was when Hurlsuk stepped down from his position as prime minister. And that really signaled to everyone that he was intending to run for president. Batoga also was intending to run for president. And I think that kind of broke. At that point, Batoga had complained that the National Security Council had not met all year. They used to meet all the time. They used to even pass emergency legislation. So that has broken down. But at the end of the day, like Mark said, it would have also been surprising to see Batoga support Esirten, his own party candidate. So he didn't. And like we said earlier, the DP has essentially turned into two parties. So Batoga could potentially have a future. He could run for parliament. He could get back involved with the party. but we'll have to see if he'll be able to actually do that. You never know. They might amend the law on president and ban him from actually getting actively involved in politics for several years. So that could be another sort of similar situation to what we saw with the Constitutional Court, where there was this gentleman's agreement that he could run, and then there was a ruling that he couldn't. Something like that could happen. And I think, I don't know the exact date, but either September or October, there's going to be a by-election for Sumir Bazo's seat. And it's possible that he could run, he could get back with the DP, and maybe the DP just splits into two different parties. So I think at this point, anything is really possible. And he's remained really silent since April. And even now, he's been quiet. So we'll have to just wait and see. Is he going to come out of the shadows post-election and start to rally people again?
Thank you both. All right, so I don't see any more hands right now, and we're just a bit over time. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap up unless anyone has a sort of a last burning question that they want to squeeze in here at the end. I want to thank Craig and Mark for staying up late and sharing all of their insights with us. Clearly, there's sort of a lot that just happened in this election and a lot to keep an eye on going forward. It looks like, Jay, did you have another question quickly?
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, thank you for the responses. The third question I had was, there's a rumor that a DP candidate who got received like 7 billion MNT from MVP. Do you have any thoughts on that? Seems like he didn't spend any of it. So
I think you can't rule anything out, but the fight within the DP extends back pretty far, and Mr. Erdogan has been at every effort fighting against President Batulga and his wing of the party. So I don't know that Mr. Erdogan would have needed that incentive to oppose President Batulga within the party. That schism was already there. But I would say that he has a history of some unethical behaviors. So I'm not going to say I have any evidence that rules out that possibility. But I think the schism within the DP was real and existed before a lot of these actions happened. And some DP insiders have said that they really did feel like, to build the party back, they kind of had to tear it down and rebuild. So I don't think that's something that's ever going to be proven. And I feel like the split in the DP was real, regardless of whether the MPP stoked the fire a bit, which I suspect they did, as they were seeking any advantage they could. But whether it came out to direct payments and things like that, yeah, I couldn't do anything more than speculate, and I don't think that would be fair to do. That he didn't spend much in his campaign and tried to conserve his money, I think what I saw would agree with that. The campaign was not particularly active, was not very visible, and it didn't seem like they were winning to win. They were running to win at any point. It was a pretty low energy, probably low cost campaign from what I saw.
And just one quick thing to add to that is just the way that S. Erdogan campaigned was quite odd. He spent almost as much time attacking Batulga, a person from his own party, that he did attacking Hurulsuk. So it seemed, I remember just coming across articles on icon.mn where he was saying, Batulga's trying to destroy democracy, Batulga's trying to rip apart the Democratic Party. It's a very odd message when you're not running against Batulga and you're running against Hurulsuk. So yeah, we can only speculate, right? I haven't seen any evidence of this, but the way that S. Erdogan did campaign was very odd. And I think that only stoked conspiracy theories even more, and questions about, is he working for the MPP, because he was essentially attacking people from his own party.
Okay. Thanks again, both. We're going to leave it there since we now well over time. I want to again thank Craig and Mark, and thank all of you for joining us today. You know, as I said, there's clearly a lot going on in Mongolia, and a lot to keep an eye on going forward as they navigate this sort of new phase in their democratic development. And you know, we at IRI, and I'm sure our friends at TAF as well, are really looking forward to working with our Mongolian friends and partners as they continue to work on strengthening their democracy there. So thank you, everyone, and have a really good day.